Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Missing Pet Consultant course. We are on number 3, Becoming a Missing Pet Consultant, Module A, Understanding Pet, Owner, and Finder Behavior. All of these are going to be super important to your success in your organization or as an individual volunteer, whatever your role is in your community. I started studying these things a few years ago because I realized working in shelters that you can talk to people until you're blue in the face, but if they're not ready to receive your message, they're not going to get it, whether you're talking about spay-neuter, healthcare, behavior, or anything. And people tend to get hung up on myths and quick fixes, as we've discussed earlier in this course, and you want to be able to reach people with real information. And it can be a lot more challenging than we might think. But we're going to talk about some of these things today and hopefully give you a better understanding of behavior so you can help people be more successful to find their pets. So first we'll talk about missing pet behavior. And this is something that I learned when I first got involved with Missing Pet Partnership back in 2008. And it was really eye-opening for me because, like everybody else, I assumed that if a pet goes missing, you can just go outside and call them, clap your hands, and shake a bag of food, and they'll come back to you. But in reality, they behave quite differently than we would expect, and quite differently than they do at home under normal circumstances. So the first thing to remember is that they are going to behave differently than they do at home in their regular routines. Whatever has happened to them, if they are ill or injured, if they've been displaced from home, if they've been transported in a car, they've gotten out in an unfamiliar location, whatever the circumstances are, they're going to be stressed and they're going to be in an unfamiliar situation. So that's number one. Number two, and this may seem obvious, is that cats and dogs are going to behave differently, although the typical person's response to looking for a missing cat or dog will be the same. So some questions to ask when you're helping someone look for a cat. Number one is the cat an indoor cat or an outdoor cat? Are they strictly indoors? Are they strictly outdoors? Do they have in and out access? Because you'll find a lot of people will say, oh, my cat is indoors, because they're mostly indoors or because they think that's what they're supposed to say. But then when you get to talking to them, they'll say, well, but I do let him out in the backyard a little bit because he likes to sun himself or something like that. So you'll get to the bottom of it, and that's important because even a little bit of outdoor access will make a difference in how they behave. Your next question is going to be, are they shy or are they an outgoing cat? What's the personality? I have too many cats at home, and most of them will hide if I have company, but I have 3 that will come out with their tails up when anyone comes to visit, including a repairman or a small child. The rest of them will become invisible until the person leaves. So that's going to make a difference on how they're going to behave out in the environment. So your indoor cat, now most cats are going to be found close to home, generally, but the indoor cat is really not going to go very far because when they get out, for whatever reason, a door was left open, the window screen breaks, whatever happened to them, they are not used to being out there. They don't know their way around. They can't navigate. The typical behavior is they'll run for a hiding place and pretty much stay there. Sometimes they will be found still in the home. So it's important to tell people, have you really looked around your home, your car? Did they climb into the car while you were getting ready for work? Did they go into the closet? Cats like to explore. Curiosity killed the cat is unfortunately true. Now this cute girl here in the picture is Flossie, and Flossie went missing from her apartment, which I believe was in Chicago. And her owner searched all over for her. She went up and down the street, went to all the businesses in her area, put up signs, couldn't find any sign of her. Now, when we talked to her, we found out that she hadn't actually seen Flossie get out, which is a red flag, but she assumed that she was outside because she was nowhere to be found in the apartment. Well, lo and behold, she found out, she let us know a few days later that she had talked to her landlord, who lives across the hall from her, and it was during a hot summer, and the residents would leave their hall doors open to let the air circulate, and their particular floor was locked, so the animals, pets, didn't have outside access. But Flossie had gone across the hall into the landlord's apartment and was later found hiding in the piano. And this was a spot where the landlord had looked around the piano because she had made him aware of the missing cat, hadn't seen her, she hadn't made a sound, but then later he discovered her in there. Now, she was just a kitten at the time, so she was probably just playing, but if a cat is older or ill or fearful, that's one example of the strange places where they can hide. One of the most important things to remember about indoor-only cats is that they may appear feral. And in the past, we had all these temperament testing methods that are now considered to be defunct, both for cats and dogs, where we were trying to determine if they were aggressive or feral. And there was this whole process of using the fake hand or the pen to see if they would bump their face up against it or swat at it. We now know, because we've been involved in so many missing pet cases with cats, that when those indoor-only cats are found, they can be the most fearful. Imagine if a cat has lived its whole life in an apartment with one person. They have no other life experience. So you can imagine how terrifying it is for them to be in a strange environment, in a room full of other cats that they've never seen before, perhaps music, a lot of people walking through the room. It's terrifying. They're going to hiss, they're going to crouch, they're going to swat. So super important to remember and not make an assumption in a shelter that these cats are some kind of feral outdoor cats, but make an assumption that every cat has an owner that's looking for them. So the outdoor cat will also usually be found close to home, but they're going to be a little farther, like this kitty in the picture was living on a farm. It's one of my kitties, and that's where I lived at the time. It was 10 acres. So had he gone missing, he could have been found probably anywhere around the property as they would explore around the barns and pastures, but probably not too far from the house and usually never off the property. So it's just important to understand where the outdoor cat usually goes and hangs out during the day. And if the owner knows this, that's going to be really helpful. You know what their usual behaviors are. The important thing to remember about outdoor access cats is that when they go missing, something has happened. So they're probably stuck somewhere. They could be injured or ill. They may have been displaced by another dog or cat. They may have been chased or attacked. And I actually talked to a woman recently whose cat had gone missing, and she was in an agricultural area, and there were a number of other more aggressive cats, possibly intact toms, who had been harassing her cat. And so they may have chased her cat, and he may be afraid to come back because he has to pass through the territory of those aggressive toms. So there's all sorts of possibilities. But the fact that they may be stuck makes it very urgent. And it's concerning that many owners of outdoor cats don't go looking that quickly. And I'm sure you've seen it. They come into the shelter and you ask them, when did your cat go missing? Oh, about 2 weeks ago. Okay, when did you start looking? Oh, just today. You know, he usually walks around and visits people. You'll get that a lot. People don't realize if your cat's been missing for 2 weeks, he could have been stuck in the barn for 2 weeks. So you need to get out there and start looking. Your shy cat, on the other hand, will hide for days or weeks. And I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't heard so many verified stories of cats that hid and survived for weeks, apparently without food or water. I've heard of so many cases. Now, they had organ damage from being away from food and water for so long, but most of them actually did survive with some supportive medical care and lived for years afterwards. Unfortunately, some did not. There was one that was brought in for neutering to the shelter where I used to work, and he was pretty much a feral cat, outdoor, not owned by any individual person, not really handleable. And he escaped and went up into the ceiling tiles. And we looked and looked, set traps, put food out, left the tiles open. After weeks, we assumed that he was gone because we never saw or heard anything. And the building was not that secure. There was a back door that didn't close very well, an old screen door, and et cetera. So we just made an assumption that the cat had at some point gotten outside and run away. Well, unfortunately, years later, when they went to do some work on the room, they took the ceiling tiles out and there was a skeleton. So the cat had actually hid up there until he eventually died, even though the ceiling tiles were left open, food was left out, attempts were made to get him out. He was so frightened that he never came down. So this is a very unhappy and gruesome story, but it's important for people to realize that a fearful cat will go to that extreme, and you really need to get in there and find them and get them out. The outgoing cat, on the other hand, is the kind that will follow you down the street when you're going for a walk, and these drive me crazy because I live no longer on the farm and now in a busy downtown, and I hate seeing cats outside because there's so much traffic. But that's that friendly cat that will follow you down the street with his tail up or want to go for a walk with you and your dogs. Now, the good thing is that they will come up to people. So if they're in trouble, if they need help, if they're lost, they will approach people. And they may actually respond when you call them, unlike many cats. The problem is that rescuers will pick these cats up and try to keep them because they assume that they've been abandoned or that they're unwanted or that the owners are irresponsible for leaving them outside. So these are the kinds of cats that will disappear because someone has taken them into their house and made an assumption that they don't have an owner. That can be a challenge because even with a microchip, you're not going to know that the cat has an owner unless you take them to the vet or shelter to be scanned. So this can be a concern with a really friendly outdoor cat who suddenly goes missing. Now for dogs, you also have kind of some basic personality types. You want to know, is that dog out exploring or is he running scared? And those two kinds of situations are going to behave very differently. Is the dog shy or outgoing, just like the cats? What is their natural personality? And a lot of that can be genetic. We tend to think that shy animals have been abused or neglected. We say dogs don't like men, they don't like people with hats. But the reality is that a lot of that stuff is genetic, and you'll see it if you raise puppies, that some of them are outgoing and some are just not. And no matter what you do, a lot of that doesn't essentially change as they grow up. So we've all seen this little guy. He's the frequent flyer. And wherever you are in the world, it may be a different breed, but in this area and in a lot of the U.S., it's the Chiweenie. They are very popular. They're a mixed breed. The shelter where I used to work was in a town called San Martin. We called them the San Martin Special, or the San Martin Street Dog. They were just a mix of little dogs that couldn't be contained on these ranches, would scoot out under any fence, run around, lift their leg all over the neighborhood. And when you try to catch them, they run back home and scoot back under the fence. So you can tell these dogs because they generally appear confident and they know their territory and they usually go back home. In fact, sometimes you even tell them go home and away they go. So these dogs aren't really lost. They're out, but they're not really lost. And sometimes the owners don't even know they're out because they'll sneak out and go back in the yard before they even notice that they're gone. The runner, on the other hand, this guy has a really different appearance. They will often have their tail tucked. They'll be fearful. They might growl at you if you try to speak to them. And these dogs are generally afraid and they're running for their life. So they may have been spooked, something may have happened, and you'll unfortunately see no shortage of these dogs after a holiday like 4th of July or New Year's Eve, where there's been a lot of fireworks, a lot of noise. If you're in an area where people are hunting and the season has started, there's going to be the gunshots, thunder, storms. These dogs are going to be running scared or for whatever reason. This is the type of dog, you don't want to chase any dog, but you really don't want to chase this type of dog because they will run into traffic. And I've unfortunately seen too many incidents where the dogs, whether people were trying to catch them or not, were so frightened that they bolted out into the road and were hit by cars. The shy dog. Now, who wants to put their hand in the crate with this little Chihuahua? Okay, so this dog will avoid people, and he will try to hide. They will often growl or bite if they are approached. And if you chase them, they'll become more and more fearful. And this is something important to remember, because if people are trying to catch them, they will become more and more fearful. So this is why you want people to get the word out, but they also need to be careful not to get the word out too much. For example, we had a case in my area of a recently adopted mini Aussie getting out. The dog was skittish, didn't know where he was, and there was such a campaign to find the dog that it ended up in the newspaper with disastrous results. You had multiple large groups of people looking for this dog, chasing the dog. The effort was not coordinated. There were different people working together at the same time. And the dog did run out into traffic and was hit by a car and did survive and was eventually captured, but ended up losing a leg. So this is what can happen if you go overboard trying to catch these dogs. The outgoing dog, just like the outgoing cat, is going to follow people. And many years ago, I had one. I was getting in my car in the morning to go to work at the shelter where I was working at the time. And I turned around, and there's a Rottweiler sitting in the passenger seat. So I'll never forget it. She had a collar on that was, the name was Sushi, written on the collar, no phone number. So there she was. She decided to go for a ride with me in the car. Never saw her before. So again, the negative aspect to this is that people may take the dog, making an assumption that it's been abandoned. But the good thing is they can be captured if they're out there and are in danger of being hit. So let's talk a little bit about owner behavior. This is something that you'll want to understand, and there's a lot of psychology around it. Some of this stuff you can look up. Now there's a lot of online articles. Psychology Today magazine has a lot of interesting stuff about the behaviors around grief and loss and how people handle change in different situations. And it's very interesting to understand and to hopefully help you to better help people, and also to manage your own feelings as you deal with people who may be angry and upset, as you will if you work in customer service. So these are some of the feelings that people will experience when they're missing a pet. And we're going to talk a little bit about each one of them. So grief avoidance. This is a behavior that we sometimes don't understand because we think the owner doesn't care. In this type of situation, the owner can't handle not knowing what has happened, and they want that mystical closure that you hear about. And in real life, there is very little closure, but it's something that we want. We want to know one way or the other, and we want to be able to move on. And if this is an owner who is so distraught that, as we discussed earlier, they can't work, they can't eat, it's causing family problems, the only way to stop it is to stop looking. And so unfortunately, you get people who really do love their pet, but they just hit that wall and they say, oh, he must have been hit by a car. He must have been killed by a wild animal. And then they just want to move on. and then they stop looking. And unfortunately, then their animal may be found or show up in a shelter weeks later, but by then they have stopped looking. Timing is another huge issue, and it's a huge issue both ways. They may not start looking right away, as I mentioned in the case of the outdoor cat. So the cat could have come and gone from a shelter in a few days. Hold periods are short across the country. So if they don't start looking for 2 weeks, their cat could have been euthanized, could have been adopted, could have been transferred to another shelter days earlier. On the other side, they will stop looking too soon. And I'm sure you'll see it at the shelter. You could categorize people. There's the people who only come once. There's the people who come maybe for a week or 2 weeks. And then there's that rare person who will come every day, every week, for months or even a year. But often they give up searching too soon. They'll give it a few days or a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then they just give up. And a big part of that giving up is because they don't get support from others. And ironically, the people who don't support them, as we discussed earlier around the societal impacts, are people who really care about the person. They just want them to move on. So they'll hear things like, oh, it's just a pet. You know, you can get another one. You shouldn't spend so much time looking. And so they don't get the support they need. If they're going to continue looking, they're going to be doing it on their own. And then there's the bad advice. There's the psychics, which we talked about. The dirty cat litter box is a myth that just will not die. You will see it on every Facebook page where someone says, put out the cat litter box. We've heard some crazy variations on this, like sprinkling vacuum cleaner contents around your house. I'm sorry, but when I vacuum, I don't want to dump it out and look at it again. I want my house to look clean. Some people have even suggested urinating. You urinate around the yard so your pet can smell it. And all of these crazy things just demonstrate a misunderstanding of an animal's basic abilities to navigate by sight or smell. And also, they are quick fixes, and they are sort of passive techniques where you're putting out a cat box and then you're just waiting. Okay, you shouldn't be sitting around waiting. You need to be actively looking and not believing in this nonsense. But people will. People who are desperate will try anything. And this is the most important problem here, is that they will waste energy doing ineffective techniques, whatever they are, whether it's the psychics, the dirty cat box, whether it's hiring a disreputable pet detective who just takes their money and takes them on a wild goose chase. When they hit that wall, they're done. And that's when the person gives up. And so now they've wasted time and money, and now they stop looking. So what you want is for them to conserve their energy and do techniques that are effective, that are known to be effective, that are most likely to find their pet, and also to give them hope, to get sightings, to get phone calls, to get pictures of their missing pet. So that resets their hope to know, okay, my cat or dog is still out there. They can still be captured and brought safely back home, and that will keep them going. Finder behavior, and this is something that we are getting more into as we move more into advocacy work in helping owners get their pets back in times when they know where their pet is and someone has their pet, whether it's at a shelter, with a rescue group, or just with an individual person who has found the pet and refuses to give it back. You can run into these behaviors and they are very challenging. Or if you're with a shelter or rescue group, you may find that you have had these feelings, and it's always harder to address your own behavior than that of other people. It's easy to say what other people should do, but you also have to look at yourself and your own beliefs, and how am I helping this owner get their pet back and keep their pet at home. Finders keepers, this is what we call it. We also believe that the owner doesn't deserve their pet back, and there's what we call the rescuer mentality, or simply a lack of knowledge of the system. So let's talk a little bit about each one of these behaviors. So finders keepers is a huge problem, and it's just because of basically our biology. We are a social species. We naturally, as a healthy person, want to take care of each other. We feel bonds with people around us, with children, babies. This is why we like looking at pictures of young children. We say, oh, how cute. These are natural behaviors because we want to take care of each other. We feel the same thing when we look at pictures of animals, which is why all those videos on the internet and pictures are so popular. We love kittens. We love puppies. It's natural. But we have to be able to determine what is a real bond and what is just in our mind. Like, you can feel that you're having a bond with an animal in a picture, but the animal's not even there. It's just a picture. So the bond is not mutual. This is a feeling that you're having by yourself. And so unfortunately, sometimes when people find an animal, they bond with it right away, and they don't want to give it up. And they give the animal a name, because naming is ownership. And I saw this even with someone that I know, and these are people that I know personally who should know better. They found a dog, a bulldog, a big, healthy, ugly bulldog, and we brought a scanner over. The dog had a chip, and while I was on the phone with the chip company, the person who found the dog was claiming all sorts of stories about the dog, that, oh, that this dog likes men better than women, this dog must have been abandoned, just this whole story that he was concocting in his mind. And I was going, stop, you just found the dog this morning, how do you know anything? And then he gave the dog a name, and literally the dog had been there for no more than an hour. So this is super common. People do this, and thank goodness the chip was currently registered, so we got the owner on the phone, who lived a couple doors down. So they were able to get the dog back. But this is something that happens all the time. And if the dog doesn't have a chip, if they don't get them scanned, if they don't make the effort, this is how animals just disappear. So this is a big one. The owner doesn't deserve the pet back. And I just dealt with a situation like this literally days ago, that someone I know has an elderly dog who looks terrible. And, that's what happens when animals get old. The dog was abandoned by a neighbor who moved away and left the little dog behind. It's a little Pomeranian Chihuahua type dog. So they took the dog in, just feeling sorry for him, not wanting to take him to the shelter, figuring he'd probably be put down. Well, the dog, despite his appearance, his teeth are rotten to the point that he almost has no jawbone, which I guess can happen. So he looks terrible, and he's quite old, but they've been taking care of him for years, and he's a happy, loved pet. Well, he got out and ended up at the animal shelter. They went down and identified him, and the shelter gave them trouble and kept the dog for 3 days while hassling the owner. And I stepped in and advised her, and she finally put her foot down and said, you don't have any right to keep my dog from me. You have to give my dog back. They wanted her to neuter the dog. They were concerned about the condition. She said, the dog is almost 20 years old. Why am I going to have him neutered now? What's the point? And he's in such poor health, I'm concerned about, putting him under. So this was a very typical situation where I knew the owner personally and was just quite upset at the way she was being treated. They also posted a picture of the dog on their Facebook page, and people were making negative statements about the owner and her family, and this just turned into a whole negative scenario, which could have been avoided had they simply talked to the owner, listened to her, and understood the situation. The dog was a rescue. He was in that condition when they got him. He was abandoned by the previous owner, and that they are taking good care of him. And at his age, who cares if he's neutered? There's nothing they can do about his jaw, so talk to the owners, get them their dog back, give the dog a microchip. They didn't even do that. So now she has to go herself to the clinic and get a rabies shot for the license and a microchip. That really should have been done at the shelter. But because people got all worked up in their beliefs about what kind of an owner she was, this is what happened. And I'm not saying people aren't lousy owners. Obviously, the previous owners were, to let the dog get in that condition and to leave him behind when they moved. But our anger is sometimes directed at the wrong people, and this can cause trouble. And if she hadn't insisted, they would have just kept that dog. So these are the things that happen. This is the kind of support that we need to give to owners to get their pets back. So the rescuer mentality, and by this, it could be someone who's with a rescue group, but more often just an individual person who finds an animal, doesn't report it, doesn't call animal control, doesn't do anything, just takes the dog and either keeps it or gives it away. And I witnessed a case like this that just upset me so much. A woman came into a dog supply shop near where I live with a small black dog that she had recently found, was young, less than a year, a puppy. And she came in with this big story about how the dog had been dumped out of a car and abandoned. And so, of course, my ears perked up when I got talking to her and said, well, how do you know this? Well, I found him alongside such and such a road. Okay, but how do you know he was dumped there? Maybe he could have fallen out of the vehicle or gotten away from home. And she got really irritated with me and insisted that the dog was abandoned, and that she knew this because the dog was sitting on a blanket alongside the road. And I've heard this before, where they believe people abandon a dog with its blanket. Now, I like to walk, and if you ever walked alongside a busy road, there's debris all over the place. There's blankets, clothing, junk. So to find a dog sitting on a piece of material that's alongside the road probably doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it was abandoned. And I tried giving this woman information. I told her to go to the shelter, which was just down the street. It was a really good shelter. She would have no concern about the dog being put down. She refused to listen to me. I found out later that she came back the next day, bought a collar and a harness and a leash for the dog, gave the dog a name, and gave it away to somebody. So she made no attempt. She never called the shelter, never did anything. So this is unfortunately a thing that we know happens. And how can that owner ever find the dog? She didn't call the shelter, didn't make a report, just made an assumption that the dog was abandoned and gave it away to another person. And then there's those who simply have a lack of knowledge. Maybe they mean well. Maybe they really care. But they don't have pets, or they don't know anything about animal shelters or laws around animals. So they're like, hey, I found an animal, and my friend has cats, so I'm just going to give it to her. People just don't know. Or they just keep the animal themselves. As we talked about earlier, the number of cats in the study that were obtained by being found was a pretty large percent. So people simply don't know. An animal comes around, they start feeding it, they keep it, or they give it to someone else. They don't have any bad intentions. They're not even making those assumptions. They just don't know. And this is where we need to get the word out, especially if we are working in an organization that has a budget for marketing. We need to get the word out there that pets are owned, pets are loved, and if an animal simply appears at your home, that it's in the pet's best interest to make that effort, to try to find the owner, to try to get the word out. So then we come to the psychology of success. And this can be super challenging, and you'll have to accept that you just won't get through to some people. Like that woman in the dog shop, that was a couple of years ago, and it still annoys me. But there was nothing I could do. I was powerless to do anything other than advise her on what she should legally do. So, number one, you want to understand the behavior of everyone involved. And at least if you understand, you can start developing processes for yourself, for your organization. You can work with this behavior rather than against it. So instead of arguing with people who come in with a certain idea, you can stay calm, explain the situation, whether they're an owner or a finder. And if they're a finder, you can advise them of the law, that they need to understand animals can be assumed to be owned, and that efforts need to be made to find that owner, and that pets are property. People don't like to hear that. They want to think that they are persons and they're family members. And while we may feel that in our own lives, legally they are property, and that gives the owner rights, that you can't take someone's dog or cat any more than you can take their TV or their car. That animal has an owner. Be kind. This can be super hard when dealing with people who are emotional, but try to identify with where that person is coming from and try to go there and work with them. And again, accepting that sometimes if that person just keeps saying, oh, I'm sure my cat was killed by a coyote, at some point you have to give up. You have the opportunity to help any number of people. And sometimes we can get really hung up on individual cases. But if that person has some notion in their head that you're not going to get past, then you just have to move on to helping the next person. And you want to always keep the goal in mind. And the goal is to find missing pets, to get them back with their owners, to help them stay home by having the home more secure, by having identification. Keep that goal in mind, be kind, and those will be your keys to success in many cases.